In the late 20th century, many European empires began to collapse under the weight of the UN and many independence movements. What was left were lots of islands or territories that did not fit into any of these new nations or were better off under European rule. A great example is the Southern Ocean, with many of these islands either one, not having any connection to the newly founded nations in Africa or existing nations in South America, two, not having enough people to be self sufficient, or three, having no native history to have resentment against European countries. These islands mostly fall under the control of France or the UK, sometimes owned by Australia, New Zealand, or South Africa. But one island is different, Bouvet, an uninhabited island, is owned by Norway. This is strange because Norway has only became independent in 1905, splitting from Sweden. This would not allow Norway to claim these islands in the usual colonial periods. The truth is that Norway's early history saw lots of territorial expansion, especially in the 1920s. In this video, we shall explore Norway's colonial empire and territorial expansion. Before we can begin, I would like to humbly ask you to subscribe. We have seen huge view milestones throughout last year without too many subscriber milestones. So if you could subscribe, comment, or even like this video, that would be greatly appreciated. When you look at Norway's territorial claims, you can primarily see one defining feature, that being that these territories seem to be hugging the Arctic and Southern Seas, or around the geographical poles of North and South. This is primarily for two reasons. One is simply because these were the last places that were truly not claimed. While other countries knew about these areas, they had little reason yet to claim and colonize much of these territories, mostly due to the harsh conditions of both continents. This means that if a country were going to colonize territories in Norway's time frame, it would probably colonize these areas. Second reason why these colonies were located near the poles is also the reason for colonization: whales. Whaling previously had sort of fallen off in modern terms, not only because of overhunting, but mostly because the whale's main resource, sperm oil, being replaced with petroleum in the 1860s. When Norway gained independence, not only were there innovations such as steam powered whale catchers and harpoons, which were mostly invented in Norway, but there was also a new demand for whale fat for items like soap. This, with an already somewhat active whaling presence in Norway, meant Norway was about to have a whaling revolution. With these new technologies, whaling efforts could now expand to areas larger than ever, primarily areas that had been dormant in recent years, like Antarctica and the Barents Sea. This led to the establishment of territorial claims in these areas to support whaling, which is how we got most of these Norwegian colonies, though there will be exceptions. The story begins with Antarctica. Expeditions by Captain Cook to the southern continent date back to the late 1700s. While he never landed on or even saw the continent, he did know of its existence and, based off of the thick fog and icebergs, concluded that it was similar to North Pole, disappointing many. After this, much of the contact with the island was with whalers. Expeditions in the 1800s mostly consisted of sailing around Antarctica and on islands in the region. Many of these expeditions were by Sweden, Norway, and then Norway after independence due to the large number of Norwegian whalers in the region. Eventually, during this time, Robert Falcon Scott rode on the Terra Nova to McMurdo Sound, Antarctica, on June 15, 1911, intending to be the first to reach the South Pole after failing to do so in 1902. Meanwhile, after failing to be the first to reach the North Pole, Roald Amundsen left in the Fram to the Bay of Whales to attempt the same feat. Amundsen not only had a 60-mile advantage, but also had a 3-week advantage, beginning his trip on October 11th as opposed to Scott's November 1st departure. On December 14th, Amundsen reached the South Pole and raised the Norwegian flag. Meanwhile, on January 18th of 1912, Scott reached the South Pole, learning of Amundsen beating him. Because Scott and the expedition began their journey late into the Antarctic summer, the return was extremely cold, along with seeing starvation. The last diary entry of his was on March 29th, before Scott succumbed to the elements. Norway's flag at the South Pole, as well as other expeditions in the late 1920s to early 30s, gave precedent to claims to the Antarctic territory, starting with Peter I Island and then all of Queen Maud's Land going to Norway, fearing a German takeover. Sadly, after the signing of the Antarctic Treaty in 1959, Norway couldn't do anything with the claims other than set up research stations such as Troll. An island Norway does have claim over is Bouvet, or Bouvet Island. Discovered in 1739 by French explorer Jean-Baptiste Louisier Bouvet, it would go on to bear his name. In 1825, George Norris landed on the island and claimed the island for the British, renaming it to Liverpool. In 1927, the first Norwegia expedition landed on the island. A small hut was constructed and the Norwegian flag was raised. The land would be claimed by Norway, which contested the British claim. In the ensuing negotiations, Norway claimed that Norris was actually on Thompson Island, meaning that Bouvet was unclaimed up until the Norway expedition. The British conceded the territory to Norway, allowing for the Norwegian annexation. Two more Norwegia expeditions visited the island, with the third building two huts and aerially photographing the island. After this, Norway did very little with the island up until the 1970s, when an AMS was set up, along with a temporary seasonal five-man station. A new station was constructed in the 1990s, and then again in 2012 after an earthquake and a winter storm knocked it into the ocean. The station studies mostly krill, as well as fur seals, penguins, and different flying birds. In 2023, Major General Nils Olav III was granted the title of Baron of Bouvet. The next island on our list is Han Mayen. While Han Mayen might have been discovered as far back as the 6th century, the first concrete discovery was in 1614 by Hans Jacobs May von Schinkelhaupt. The island would be given Dutch whale boilers and fortifications, which 1,000 workers operated, its peak population. An attempt was made by 7 Dutchmen to stay through the winter months due to fear of attack, which ended their lives. The island almost single-handedly destroyed the Greenland whale, which drop in population ended the operations on the island, with the Dutch completely abandoning it in 1650. Interest in the island spiked up again in the 1880s when an Austro-Hungarian expedition stayed on the island during the first international polar year. They completely mapped the island, which would be used up until the 1950s. By the century's end, Norwegian trappers began hunting foxes and polar bears on the island. After the establishment of a meteorological station in 1921, the Kingdom of Norway officially annexed the island in 1929. During the Second World War, the island remained a part of Free Norway, with the re-establishment of a meteorological station, and later, the United States radio station. 2 German planes even crashed into the island with no survivors. Today, only one small town of Oinkelblien is on the island, along with multiple cabins across the island. Ultimately, 18 people usually live on the island, with 14 soldiers and 4 running the weather station. Norway's only overseas territory with a permanent population is Svalbard. The first confirmed sighting was by Willem Barent on June 17, 1596. The Dutch were attempting to find a faster route to China through a northeastern passage and discovered the islands. Sadly, the White Swan became trapped in ice and Barent died in northern Russia on that expedition. Eventually, the islands would become the site of whaling activity, as all Arctic islands did in the early 1600s. Bergen would be established in 1619, and over 10,000 whalers inhabited the island, coming from all across Europe. Sadly, just like Han Mayen, the overhunting of the Greenland whale led to diminishing returns, leading to the abandonment of Bergen in the late 17th century. After this, Russian hunters began to hunt on the island for furs and seals starting in 1697, but a large population would never settle there. Norwegians would soon inhabit the islands by the 1800s, hunting and making discoveries across the islands. The question of ownership would only come up in the early 1900s, when a mining boom would occur on the islands, incentivizing countries including Sweden, Norway, America, Russia, and the UK. The issue was put on hold when World War I began, but it was resolved when the Treaty of Versailles declared Norway had regency over the territory. The Svalbard Treaty of 1920 gave more specifics to Norway's ownership. While Norway had administrative power, other nations could also participate in economic activities. Today, Svalbard is one of the few places where you don't need a passport to enter from a foreign country. Modern-day Svalbard also has a seed vault, which contains seeds for plants fundamental to human civilization. Norway's colonization is strange, to say at the least. In modern times, these islands have very little use other than territorial waters. With all these islands not having a native population, Norway has managed to hold onto all of its overseas territories and will most likely keep them for the foreseeable future.